new opening, and so it's lovely to see all of your smiling faces here this evening for what we have quite grandly, I hate to say, called the transhumanism debate. So other debates are available, but I hope perhaps this might be the best one. Some housekeeping before we start. Downstairs at the OQS Cafe, they will continue to serve drinks and, in fact, food for the rest of the evening. So if you are peckish or just looking for a bit of conversation after the event, then do go down and stay there because we'll all come and join you. There's plenty of time for questions at the end of the debate. So what we'll do is we'll start with 2 5-minute opening statements from our 2 fabulous speakers tonight. And then after that, we will have a conversation up here on the stage. And then there'll be plenty of time to hear from you and also our viewers online. Hello to everyone who is joining us over the waves. And we'll be able to create a kind of hybrid cyborg event using all of these different kind of cameras and fiddly things that we've got in the room. So the one thing I should say to you before we start is that you must subscribe to UnHerd. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but you should do it because you will be the first person to hear about these events at Old Queen Street, and also read all of our fabulous articles, including by people like Harrington Elise, who we have every day posting incredible philosophy, politics, culture, and commentary about all of the things that no one else really wants you to hear about. So join us if that's your kind of thing, which I hope if you're in this room, then it is. Let me get to our guests. We have an incredible pair of guests here tonight. First, Elise Bohan, who is a self-professed transhumanist, perhaps a dirty word for some and for others a badge of honor. She is a senior research scholar at the University of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, which is quite a grand name itself, which is part of the Faculty of Philosophy. And she's also the author of the world's first history of transhumanism, Future Superhuman, Our Transhuman Lives in a Make or Break Century. So there's a lot to play for here if you are Elise. Mary Harrington is a regular UnHerd contributor who you might have met before at one of our other events, or perhaps read her work on the UnHerd magazine. She is probably the least transhumanist person I know, which is why I called her up when we were thinking about this event. She's a contributing editor here at UnHerd and also the author of a very exciting upcoming book, Feminism Against Progress, which is published by Swift Press. So get excited for that. So the question we're here to discuss tonight is a pretty big one. Is transhumanism a force for good? Now, that, of course, begs the question, what the hell is transhumanism? And that is something that we want to get into, and everyone has slightly different definitions. But I wanted to start, so bear with me here to bore you for a second, with a little bit of a definition of my own, so at least we have something to go from. Transhumanism was popularized as an idea by the English biologist and philosopher Julian Huxley in the 1950s. And it's basically an idea that we should adapt human bodies and brains with the aid of technology. I'll just read you a short quote from his original essay, which was called Transhumanism, coining the term. It is as if man had been suddenly appointed managing director of the biggest business of all, the business of evolution, appointed without being asked if he wanted it and without proper warning and preparation. What is more, he can't refuse the job. Whether he wants to or not, whether he is conscious of what he is doing or not, he is, in point of fact, determining the future direction of evolution on this earth. That is his inescapable destiny, and the sooner he realizes it and starts believing in it, the better for all concerned. So it's a fairly big job we've got on our hands today. Transhumanism can cover a lot of things. It can include genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, even cryonics, an area I'm not sure I'm exactly an expert in. But transhumanists hope that we can do amazing things with technology, reverse aging, increase lifespans, quality of life, and enhance the cognitive capacities of the human spirit, which all sounds pretty good to me. But what was once science fiction has now become science fact. For people with disabilities, new technologies are unarguably an amazing thing. Imagine being someone who has an amputation in an age without prosthetics, or someone with a heart condition in an age without pacemakers. But companies vying for market dominance are taking forays into leveling up able-bodied people as well, into human hybrids, traditionally known as cyborgs. So we're talking about things like artificial wombs, brain-computer interfaces like Elon Musk's Neuralink, which has been in the news a lot recently. So should we draw a line when it comes to optimizing the human experience? Could our endless search for eternal life lead us down some dark and dangerous roads? Will these small tweaks create a new class of human, or adapted human, or even post-human? That's what we're trying to find out tonight. So is this just the natural step in evolution, or are we going down a very dangerous path indeed? Let's begin by turning to Elise, who's got our optimistic pitch for embracing a transhuman future. I'll ask Elise to step up to the lectern, and could you all welcome her to the stage?
Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for coming along to be here tonight. I'm really excited about having a debate in a forum like this because I think there is such a dearth in our world of people coming from different sides, trying to come together, not necessarily to cohere on a single vision, but actually to explore how the tension between their ideas can help us think more clearly about complex issues that face us in the modern world. And I'm particularly excited because I think that Mary and I actually agree on an awful lot. As far as I can glean, we both agree that we're living in the Anthropocene and that this matters. We seem to agree that there is a transitional moment happening for humanity right now. There is this infusion of ever more technology in our world, and that this is clearly having disruptive ramifications on so many of us. Some of those forms of disruptions you might frame in terms of the idea of collateral damage, which is a scary and emotionally confronting word. But we can think of some examples of that, of increasing disruption of our life scripts, of atomization, of increasing mental illness. And I think, as Mary may raise later on, the issue of more and more people, particularly young people, struggling to find really rich forms of emotional, sexual, and romantic fulfillment in this world. I'm also someone who really believes in the wisdom of Chesterton's fence. I do think that we should be reluctant to dismantle systems and things in our world until we know what they're for. Every tweak you make in a complex system inherently will come with trade-offs. And I expect that Mary is going to really foreground for us some of the valid reasons that we might worry about the encroachment of transhumanist technologies in our world. I also think there was wisdom in the words of the late Christopher Hitchens, who wrote in the wonderful book, Letters to a Young Contrarian, "Beware the irrational, however seductive. Shun the transcendent and all who invite you to subordinate or annihilate yourself. Don't be afraid to be thought arrogant or selfish. Picture all experts as if they were mammals. Never be a spectator of unfairness or stupidity. Seek out argument and disputation for their own sake. The grave will provide plenty of time for silence." There is so much about this quote that resonates with me. But as with most things, there is wisdom on both sides. While there is validity to a warning to shun the transcendent when somebody is inviting you to subordinate yourself, I would also say, beware of anyone who tells you that you and your familiar life scripts and ways of being are both special and superlative, and that they must be clung onto for dear life in perpetuity because they are the right ways, the best ways, and indeed, the only ways. Whatever else you might think of it, transhumanism brings something incredibly valuable to the modern intellectual landscape. It is ballsy in a way that few modern types of thought are. And of course, I know that being ballsy is not an inherent virtue. But being able to contemplate possibilities beyond yourself and your species is, I really think, a sign of a deep, curious, active, intelligent mind. Take note that I am not saying an unimpeachable mind, and that I don't think every extension of that line of thinking is something that should be acted upon. But transhumanists do at least help bring us back from the brink of that sometimes very rigid anthropocentrism that we get locked into, where we can only think within the orbit of ourselves and our species. Now, why can it be dangerous to not be able to look beyond who and what we are? Well, as any macro historian like myself, or any complex systems thinker, or even any environmentalist will tell you, human beings just simply don't exist in a vacuum. We are an emergent property of billions of years of evolution. We weren't here in the beginning. We will not be here at the end. And we clearly aren't the be-all and end-all of existence. We're the result, as we know, of single-celled organisms appearing on a rock in a spiral galaxy and not standing still. At any evolutionary transition in history, you could say, well, why not freeze it there? Isn't that enough? How much is too much? Isn't it sort of ticking along just fine? Why do we need to add new stuff like multicellular life, the emergence of sexual reproduction, nervous systems, spines, brains, all of these new additions, the Cambrian explosion? There was always a point where hypothetically you could say, why not hit pause? And we're at another one of those transitional moments today. But if I asked you, do you really think it would be better if we paused evolution sometime before hominids emerged? And the planet was only ever populated with microorganisms and plants. Would you say that it would be good overall that humans never evolved and never had the chance to do something wonderful and big and remarkable with these flawed, yes, but very unique and incredible and powerful brains that we have? If you leave plants alone for millions of years, you're probably not going to get libraries, self-awareness, the richness of philosophy, or the beauty of love. Yet in far less time, humans have taken their self-awareness and discovered astonishing things like the workings of DNA. They've looked into the cosmos. They've discovered concepts like what it might be like inside of a black hole. We've built pyramids in the desert. We've sent rockets to other worlds. There are those among us who are capable of doing things like painting the Mona Lisa. And of course, we can now store our collective wisdom in ways that no other species can, through storytelling, writing and printing books, and now we're storing information in the cloud. What that amounts to is that we're giving rise, we have already given rise, to a global digital brain. And that brain looks poised in this century, or not long after, to take on a life of its own. So you might say that we're kind of the means, but not the end of this transition, because no evolutionary phenomenon, and humans, by the way, are an evolutionary phenomenon, is an end. Obviously, no organism wants to be superseded and give way to the next big thing. But wouldn't we argue that at least in some respects, we're an improvement on a bacterium, a tree frog, or a cockroach? And surely it behooves us to entertain the possibility that a post-human form of intelligent life would think that they were an improvement on us. And for all the wonders that I've just cited about the human brain and the edifices that we've built, if we think about the horrors past and present, if we think about slavery and female genital mutilation and how badly we handled COVID, how much we failed to prepare for the big threats on the horizon, how much we're still to this day dropping the ball on climate change, the fact that we have myopia and tribalism built in to our brains and the design of what we are, could we really say in good faith that they don't have a point? The big picture perspective here is the long view from modern science. It's the evolutionary view. And the thing is, it's not either or. I'm not here today as the resident technological zealot who's trying to convert you to a card-carrying movement. I'm not a part of a transhumanist movement. I think the philosophy, broadly speaking, is really valuable because it helps us think about weird stuff that often we're afraid to think about. But it doesn't follow that you can't think about post-human futures or take them seriously without having to sign up to this kind of ideological zealotry. What this big picture really says is that this too shall pass. And that doesn't preclude thinking very deeply about the things that are going wrong in the present and causing many of us grief. I absolutely believe that in the short term, and especially the next decade, we need to get a lot better at humaning. We need to shore up our institutions. We need to rethink our education systems. We need much more focus on raising kids to be connected, strong communicators, empathetic, divorced as much as possible from this arms race of exams and credentialing and higher education, and as well divorced from the brain junk of smartphones and tablets. I absolutely believe in fighting for this and fighting for the human world for as long as we're still human. But I also wager that given what human beings are, given that corruption and perverse incentives will win the day most of the time in this environment, it makes sense as well to have one foot in the human camp, but another somewhere near that transhumanist camp as well. I don't think it's necessarily bad that in the long run, we end up seeding forms of digital intelligence that might be smarter than us. This has happened before. With our big brains, we proved to be better adapted to life in the Holocene than many of our competitors. With their new, different, and perhaps bigger brains, the AIs of the future may prove themselves to be better adapted to life in this transhuman world that we're in now. Yes, there is so much wrong that could go wrong in these transitional times, and some of it already is. There's a lot of good reason for anxiety. I'm a meliorist, but I'm not a utopian. I don't want to stand here, wave my hands and say technology will make everything great again, because it's going to make some things better and it's going to make some things worse. But looking at the big picture, I would rather some intelligence survives than none. And it's not at all clear to me that humans can survive in this niche as we are, unaugmented, for much longer. In an ideal world, I do think we probably would slow this transition down. It's not clear to me that we definitely should, but it's relatively clear to me that we're not going to, because every incentive pulls us in the other direction. So my challenge to Mary and to the members of the audience who are sitting here thinking, I really don't like it when I hear about this transhumanist stuff. I want to get off the train. I get that. But where do you want to go instead? And how do you propose that we get there? Thank you very much.
Thanks to Elise there. Many thanks to Elise. And now for Mary for the voice of anxiety in this. And a few words of caution. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Elise. That was very interesting and very measured and very enlightening. I hope you'd agree, Elise, broadly speaking, with the working definition of transhumanism I'll offer here, just very, very succinctly. A worldview in which human nature has no special cultural or political status, and where it's not just legitimate, but sometimes morally necessary to employ technology, especially biotechnology, to improve on that nature where it's appropriate. Would you say that's acceptable?
I've never heard it phrased in such a way. Loosely speaking, yes.
Okay, so that's we converge well enough on that. Okay. When we talk about transhumanism, the temptation is to depict it as an exciting or frightening possible future. You know, something which happens out there in the future or may come, but in any case, one that hasn't entirely happened yet. But another point on which I think you and I both agree is that that's the wrong way of looking at it. In fact, transhumanism is already here. I go actually further, I think, than Elise in saying it's so well established that there's arguably no point in having this debate. You know, congratulations, Elise, your side already won. You know, okay, we can all go to the bar. That's it, we're done. I'm joking, of course. There's lots to talk about. Loads to talk about, not least what we can infer from how the transhumanist era is going so far. To my eye, this era began in the mid-20th century, before you and I were born, with a biomedical innovation that radically changed what it is to be human in the human social order, reproductive technology. The pill was the first transhumanist technology. It set out not to fix something that was wrong with normal human physiology, you know, in the ameliorative sense of medicine up to that point. And instead, it introduced a whole new paradigm. It set out to interrupt normal in the interests of individual freedom. At one point, Elise, in your book, your excellent, well-written book, which I encourage everybody to buy because it's got some very spicy takes in it, and it's very, very, very well written. Elise notes that avowed transhumanist women are rarer than men, which is an interesting point, which I've wondered about as well. And if I remember rightly, you postulate that this is because men are typically, you know, systems thinkers are typically more prevalent among men than women. I'm paraphrasing.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I'd say on the contrary, the reason transhumanist women seem rare is that they're so common they don't read as transhumanist. Nearly every adult woman in the developed world has implicitly accepted the belief that full adult female personhood is structurally reliant on technologies that interrupt normal female fertility. And by the definition I opened with, that makes nearly every adult woman in the developed world a transhumanist. So, how's the transhumanist era going? Well, the pill was legalized in 1960 in America, 1961 in Britain. So we have more than 6 decades worth of data on how transhumanist practice in that context measures up to transhumanist theory. What I suggest we can infer from the stories so far in that instance is that trying to re-engineer our physiology, our nature, if you will, in the interests of freedom, progress, or whatever other name you give, you don't, I realize you say you're not a utopian, but that many utopians would give, doesn't in fact deliver utopia. Or rather it does, kind of. But it happens asymmetrically. Utopia arrives asymmetrically, depending on where you sit in the socioeconomic hierarchy. And where technology is used to liberate us from the kind of givens, such as normal female fertility, that were previously managed pragmatically by social or legal norms, what replaces it isn't a human person, free from nature, but a market in which that nature becomes a set of supply and demand problems. In the case of sex, the transhumanist pill revolution didn't deliver, as the feminist Shulamith Firestone imagined, a polymorphous liberation of human sexuality. Or it did, kind of, but under the sign of commerce. We got the so-called sexual marketplace, in which normative asymmetries in male and female mating preferences reappear in cartoon form, as market opportunities, or as strategic weaknesses to be weaponized in a contest for personal gain, or straightforwardly as commodities to buy, sell, or exploit. Meanwhile, if those at the top of the food chain are relatively well placed to thrive in this quote-unquote marketplace, those at the bottom, impoverished, racialized, trafficked, or otherwise vulnerable people, specific, particularly women, are far more likely to become commodities themselves. I would argue further that the same logic will be likely to hold for any other embodied limit you destroy via biotech. I predict that should we find a cure for aging, for example, it won't be universally available. It will be prohibitively expensive, and it will serve primarily as a tool for further consolidating wealth and power among those who can access it. Perhaps it will require harvesting tissue from others. The fertility industry already has a thriving market for gametes, or indeed reproductive quote-unquote services, also known as renting somebody's womb. But so far it's not rich, well-connected people who sell themselves in this way, who sell parts of their body. Research is already being done into blood transfusions as an anti-aging treatment, and you can be sure that should it flourish, it won't be rich people selling their plasma. You'd have to be wildly optimistic to think we can blithely marketize ever greater swathes of our embodied selves without opening new vistas for class asymmetry and exploitation. And it makes no sense to argue that we will stay well protected against such risks by moral safeguards, at least not within a transhumanist paradigm, because transhumanism itself requires an all-out assault on the humanist anthropology that underpins those moral safeguards. You can't have transhumanism without throwing out humanism. And by this I mean, with the greatest respect, the assertions that you've made, some of which I would dispute, or at least want to complicate, Elise, about the fact that we're nothing but cells which have become slightly more complicated by a series. I'm paraphrasing. By a series of happenstances. What?
That's quite a paraphrase.
Okay. Well, we're going to come back to this. It'll be fun. I look forward to it. Okay. But you can't throw out transhumanism. You can't have transhumanism unless you throw out humanism. And here I do quote directly from you. If people are just ape-brained meat sacks, in your extraordinarily spicy phrase, ape-brained meat sacks, everybody. Elise is a wonderful coiner of phrases. And we're urgently in need of upgrading our ape-brained meat sacks. What possible reason could we have for objecting to a market in human organs, or infanticide, or genetically engineering the masses to be more docile? All of these are only repellent when you hold them against a humanist anthropology. So if you're assaulting that anthropology in the name of humanist values, upgrading us, so in the name of compassion or kindness or freedom or lives lived in greater dignity, I submit that the project is unlikely to work out the way you think it will. So in sum, we're already well into the transhumanist era, but the story so far suggests that far from delivering utopia, what it mostly delivers is a commodification of the human body that disproportionately benefits those who already have power and privilege. I don't think we can put this back in its box. In that, again, I agree with you. But to my eye, the proper response to this era is not stamping our foot on the accelerator, but a twofold resistance, and or perhaps even just a twofold note of caution. Firstly, in retaining a humanist anthropology, in defiance of all those currently sawing away at the branch we're sitting on. And secondly, in mounting a vigorous defense of those without power, now increasingly at the sharp end of biotech's unacknowledged class politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that. I think there's only one place we can really start there, and it's got to be the ape-brained meat sacks. So I will allow Elise to come back with some response to that distillation of your view. I'm sure there are more complexities there to be found. So tell us a bit about how you respond to what Mary's just said. Do you feel that there can be no transhumanism unless we do away with humanism entirely?
I'm not sure, because historically I think of transhumanism as very much an outgrowth of Enlightenment humanism. So you're taking this worldview, initially we've got this kind of religious humanism. We're still kind of thinking about the elevation of the human spirit. This transitions into Enlightenment humanism, where we're thinking about increasingly using science and technology, but particularly education and cultural tools to draw out the better angels of our nature, to bring out the best of what's inside us. And to the extent that Mary's asking us to do that, I'm totally on board with that. As I say, I think we do need to get better at humaning. But I think we cannot turn a blind eye to all of the ways, when I use a phrase like ape-brained meat sack, yes, there is shock value in that, but part of it is to try and bring us back to some of the things that we're determined not to see about ourselves. So there's a chapter in my book called What's So Great About Humanity Anyway? And we all know that there's lots of things, and I've cited many of those things in my opening talk. But we're so much more reluctant to come to terms with the fact that 100,000 people die every single day from age-related causes. The fact that we do slowly decay and fall apart, often much before we feel we've had enough time with our loved ones, and particularly those of us who relish time spent in our minds and time spent learning. There is never enough time to read all the books, to learn. And the tragedy of that, I think, is also that when people do die, it is almost like, I think a colleague of mine, Anders Sandberg, says that when somebody dies, the library burns, because all of that wisdom that they're carrying around in their minds, that it took decades and decades to build up inside of them, gets extinguished. And I think there is something about this idea of we need to bring back those humanist values that is so tempting, because I've spent most of my youth and most of my life championing those and believing in those, and I still do to some extent. But the fact that when we're talking about the commodification of the body, the fact that there is just this kind of naive, perhaps capitalistic encroachment on parts of us that feel like they are dehumanizing. I think Mary's right about that, to the extent that that's not putting words in your mouth. I really, really worry about, I agree that the contraceptive pill was an incredibly disruptive innovation. I personally think it's insane that we routinely put teenagers on it, that it's taken as a substance that is just so blindly accepted without really understanding. And that's where I would push back against some of the framing with Mary as just this, you know, women are innately transhumanist. Partly I'm assuming there's a glibness there, but the idea that innately, because women are sort of like, great, we love controlling our reproductive systems in this way, what I really think is happening there is just mass naivety. I think the average person who gets a prescription from the pill, for a doctor who barely has a 30-second conversation with them before they prescribe it, is not an ardent champion of technology, is not an ardent believer in some kind of modern philosophy that's co-opted their minds that makes them want to expunge their bodies. They genuinely don't understand the trade-offs. They genuinely are so detached from the sense of themselves as an embodied being that I do think we're moving further and further away from that. But where I can't just sit in humanism where Mary sits is that when I talk about the ape-brained meat sack, the idea there is that there is this growing chasm between our Paleolithic brains and what we're designed for and the niches we're built to inhabit, and this new technologically infused world that we're living in. We have changed our environment so rapidly and so radically, and we have not kept pace with that change. So either we keep changing the environment or we change ourselves to fit the environment. And I think the fact that we're consistently making these commodified decisions in which we do expunge more and more of our humanity in favor of profit, in favor of short-term decisions, in favor of such abysmal thinking when it comes to complex systems like the human body, it is a testament to the fact that these brains are not built for this world. We are not going to be adequate stewards of this system that is now so complex that to keep it held together, you actually need a new form of intelligence beyond what we are.
So in your speech, Mary, you started by saying that it's kind of too late for us to roll back the clock here. We're already in an age of transhumanism. So if we take what Elise has just said there, how can we argue against adapting our kind of ape brains if the system has already moved on without us?
Well, you're assuming that we can adapt our ape brains, or you're assuming that, I mean, this is assuming that we're going, that we have the capability to do so and to produce results which are predictably what we want them to be. And I think where I started with the worked example of the pill as the first transhumanist technology was in order to suggest that the theory and the practice, or at least the various feminists who hailed this as a great innovation in human freedom and the futures that they envisaged off the back of this great innovation, are not exactly what we ended up with. And I would submit that were we to find ways of engineering our quote-unquote ape brains, what would be very likely to happen would not be some sort of putative human better equipped to deal with the complex world that we have. It would instead be something more like a cartoon, very much a repeat of what we've had with the pill, which is to say, you know, I'm just skeptical that we can re-engineer our human nature. I don't think it works like that. I think what happens when we try and emancipate ourselves from human nature via technology is that it just comes back in cartoon form via the market, or it comes back in cartoon form via some unexpected means. In a sense, we can't evade our fate. You know, there's and I think that fundamental. I think to me, there's a tragic quality to that, which we just have to embrace and we have to lean into. You know, the sort of the human condition is, in a sense, a tragic one, and trying to argue our way out of that via technology, you know, is hubris, which, you know, as the Greeks would suggest to us, you know, from a long time ago, ends up with nemesis.
Are we too optimistic then? Is there too much hope in technology? Are we searching for that answer, that silver bullet that's actually not there.
Well, I mean, it's really enticing. You know, at the end of the day, you know, I'm as cyborg as they come. I'm permanently Bluetoothed to the internet. Yeah, I'm a fully paid up cyborg.
I mean, Elise, you say in your book that actually we've got a whole generation of young people who are already
fully paid up
hybrid
cyborgs.
cyborgs. They live half their life on the internet.
You know,
I mean, Mary is someone who lives a lot of your life on the internet. You know, there are many people who work UnHerd who sit all day on the internet,
Yeah,
me included.
Sally,
you
my
know?
editor, said to me earlier, "Mary, get off the internet," and I was like, "You cannot be serious." You know, this. I mean, it's you know, so in a sense, you know, when I say I'm skeptical about being able to re-engineer our human nature, I don't, you know, just to re-emphasize, I don't think we can put the cyborg era back in the box. I think that's where we are, and it's where we've been for, you know, more than half a century. But I am skeptical of this idea that we can escape our human nature. I think that's a hubris. That's the sort of hubris which, and you know, the ancient Greeks had a very clear idea of where that ends up.
See, I actually agree with you. There's a wonderful C.S. Lewis quote from a treatise he wrote, I think in the 50s, maybe the 40s, called The Abolition of Man. And he was really pushing back against the techno-meliorists of his age. And he said one of the most beautiful lines from it is that man's conquest of nature is really, in the end, only nature's conquest of man. I think it's absolutely true. But I think there's a distinction that I would make here in terms of the vision of us becoming cyborgs and literally changing our brains. I mean, our brains are just ridiculously complex. I don't discount the possibility that maybe advanced technologies in the future could map it in incredibly precise ways, and there could be things like brain uploading, but I am deeply skeptical of all that. When I talk about a post-human future and I talk about the thing that evolves from humanity, it's not actually us, the people in this room, coming along for the ride. We get told that by transhumanists a lot, and I think that's the wrong message. It's not about you get to upload your brain and live forever, stick your head in a vat of liquid nitrogen and we'll resurrect you in the glorious future. I agree with Mary's skepticism there, but I do think it is eminently plausible that from this global digital brain we have created, we will build up artificial intelligence that is generally intelligent. It's not going to think in the same ways as you or I, because it doesn't have a brain, but it's going to think, and it's going to claim to have feelings, and it's going to claim to have personhood, and it's going to resemble something we would recognize as personhood. And it is eminently plausible that that thing goes on to be a consciousness that explores the stars, that unravels the mysteries of the universe. Again, never perfectly and never without unexpected things that go wrong as a result of all of that. But something that goes on from beyond us, I do find hope in that, even though I'm not going to be a part of that. Because as I say, I would rather intelligent life persists to keep the torch of knowledge and enlightenment alive than kind of sinking into this, I'm a digital cyborg, it's coming for me, there's nothing I can do, but I'm angry about it.
This brings us on to the question of long-termism, though, doesn't it? Which is a word that I don't think many of us had heard before about 3 months ago. And then suddenly we all found out about these people called the effective altruists and figures like Sam Bankman-Fried and the disaster that happened there with this desire to create long-term solutions to massive global problems of inequity, climate change, whatever you want to call it. And I suppose the question there is, does that come at a huge material cost to the people who live now? And what would that cost be? And what could the risks of that long-term thinking be for people who have to live in this moment where we are?
I suppose what I would say to that, there's something my dad always used to say, was if I was going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here. But by that I mean, I don't know that we can assume that some point 1,000 years in the future is going to have the same moral, political, economic, or social priorities as we do. It's very, very clear, you know, even the most rudimentary grasp of history or literature ought to make it clear that people 1,000 years ago didn't have the same priorities as us now. And if you can frame that difference as progress in our favor or as decline in their favor, as you wish. But it's very clear that consciousness evolved. It's clear enough to me that consciousness and culture evolves over time, and there are threads of continuity, and that's, I think, something that you and I both have in common, is tracing some of those lines.
Yeah.
But it's very clear that how people think about what's important changes tremendously over even a century, let alone over 1,000 years. So I question the hubris of any movement which claims to have any kind of any kind of handle on what might matter in 25,000 years' time. I just don't see how you can do that. It's absurd.
I suppose, which brings us on to the moment we're in, which is a very strange mixed world, a hybrid world, you might say, where we have some people who do have access through capital and immense amounts of privilege to these kind of transhumanist developments. Many, the most who don't. And then we also have large amounts of people who are living in a way that transhumanists in 500 years might think as almost medieval, with extremely strong religious beliefs and traditional lifestyles. So how do we kind of make sense of this mixed world? Perhaps we are leading into a completely cyborgian future, but we have to live right now where we are. What happens to the idea, for example, of the human soul, dare I say it, in a world that's starting to transition into this kind of techno future?
Short answer is we don't know, but it seems like in the short term, there is some degradation of how much weight we place on, if you will, spiritual fulfillment and connection. I think some of that is slipping in our world and to our detriment, and that we do need to bring that back. In terms of inequality, though, I think we are very good at honing in on the ways in which the world remains imperfect, and there are ways in which it is egregiously unfair today. But we discount the fact that so many of the gains of the last 100 to 250 years have been enabled by the Industrial Revolution, have been enabled by harnessing the hubris of harnessing fossil fuels, harnessing more energy from the environment, allowing us to agglomerate in cities, which when you do this, when you collect all of people in a room like this, you're actually creating a more powerful hive mind by bringing intelligence together so that it can share ideas at closer range and it can innovate faster. And through that, for all the trade-offs, which are undeniable, there's many negatives that have come from that, we're very quick to discount when we talk about future biomedicine, we're very quick to discount things like polio vaccines and the virtual eradication of that disease along with smallpox, of the fact that we have got so many infectious diseases under control. We struggle with the big killers like cancer and heart disease at the moment. Those are sort of like the biggest global threats. But through basic innovations, through modern sanitation, through better housing, all of which the Industrial Revolution enabled, we have lifted so many people out of poverty. And yes, we created new tiers of poverty, but overall, fewer people are living in abject poverty today than in the past. We have higher average global life expectancies. Child mortality has plummeted. The fact that you can give birth by cesarean section rather than, in the case of my mother, giving birth to a dead child, which is what would have happened to me because my umbilical cord was wrapped twice around my neck. The fact that technology can intervene and bring us so many of these spoils of modernity that we readily take for granted. I don't know where, there's obviously a tension, but I don't know at what point you say we want to hit pause or indeed we want to go backwards. Again, the challenge sort of remains. Like, we agree we're barreling on this trajectory. If we're not going to get off it, then we need to think about how we manage it as well as possible. And that means we need to think about how AI becomes a healthy part of our world, or indeed if it can.
Can it? Can we coexist with AI? Or should we be pulling the brakes?
Well, we already are coexisting with AI. You know, we've all been training the Google search algorithm for 20 years. I mean, I've been personally training the Google search algorithm by letting it scrape my email account for 20 years. You know, we're doing that. You know, whether it's a healthy thing or not, I think is quite a complicated question. We'll probably be here for a whole other evening.
Yeah.
what I want here
teasing
is
out the pros and cons of that.
a kind of pitch for the soul here. I mean, you know, we talk about the idea that we can maximize the length of life, and you spoke a bit about the library that burns when someone dies. I mean, you know, you could just replace the word library with the word soul, and what you'd have there is an idea that there is something ineffable about the human spirit that leaves. But is a longer life always a better life? And you know, where should we kind of draw that line?
I'm unconvinced that a longer life is always a better life. I don't see why that's self-evident. I think about my grandmother, who was a doctor and a farmer, and a mother, among many other things, over the course of her 97-year life. So, you know, and having been all of those things, she had a very pragmatic, grounded view of what should be done and when. And I remember witnessing her living will that she wrote when she was in the care home, and that went through, you know, scenario after scenario, what she wanted under what circumstances. You know, do I want to be resuscitated if I'm injured in this way or that way? And you know, it was not a fun afternoon, put it that way. And by the end, she needed a sherry or two because she was looking a bit green around the gills. But it was also a blessing, because later she developed dementia and she fell out of bed and she broke her finger. And had she been taken to the hospital, as the ambulance, which they were obliged to call, wanted to do, she probably would have died confused and miserable in hospital. As it was, the nursing home cared for her there. They splinted her finger and she was fine. And when she died, she made it very clear that she wanted to go. She didn't want to be artificially kept alive by 1,001 different means. When she went, she wanted to go. And she wanted a wake. We sat with her body in my mum's front room in the middle of a heat wave with ice packs around it for 3 days, and watched with her in the old-fashioned way, because that was what she wanted. And that memory, I was preparing for my wedding at the time. I was making wedding favors at the table, while with grandma in her coffin in the next room. It was a very strange time. And that the proximity of a new phase of my life with the death of my grandmother, and my sense that she was with us in that, she was very present. It felt to me, it was an extraordinarily rich, very strange, intense time. But in a sense, it was her last gift. And I don't see that her life having come to an end was in any way diminished the life that she had. And I'm not sure that trying to prolong it in the way that she very clearly didn't want it prolonged would have been in any way better. I mean, there's a huge amount more that we could say about the attempt to prolong life infinitely. But I suppose I think about the kind of the low-level war, the low-level intergenerational warfare, which is afoot in pretty much every developed world country over property ownership and the cost of living, which is, you know, again and again and again skewed in favour of the generation which benefited from the post-war economic boom. In its totality, perhaps argues against the idea that we should allow a privileged class to prolong their lives indefinitely. You know, I see the war between the Zoomers and the Boomers on steroids, you know, globalized, and I don't like that picture.
Or the Boomers who might live forever.
Right, you know, that subset of Boomers who could afford to live forever.
The ultra Boomer.
Yeah, exactly. You know, exactly the sort of maxi Boomer.
So let's move on to something that you both spoke about a little bit there, and something that I think is quite interesting, considering that you did say, Elise, that there aren't many female transhumanists who know, and yet we are 3 women, I assume, here on the stage, perhaps wrongly, but there you go. And there is a big question here about women's rights, the role of women in a transhuman world, and of course, the thing that comes to mind is the idea of artificial wombs, surrogacy. You spoke a little about the basically the abuse of the poor in this kind of surrogacy trade. Well, surely I suggest to you, and perhaps Elise you would agree, that an artificial womb might be the cure for that particular issue, which is the manipulation of those with less material means in that kind of particular industry. So let's talk a little bit about that. Artificial wombs, surrogacy, how does that kind of fit into this puzzle?
I suppose the first thing I should say about this is that once upon a time, really, yeah, when I was in my 20s, I used to have recurring nightmares about accidental pregnancy. I was that terrified. I would literally wake up in a cold sweat because I dreamed that I'd become unwantedly pregnant with somebody who I didn't really love. And the idea terrified me at a visceral level. The idea of losing control of my physiology and then being left with this sort of 18-year commitment to a dependent creature. It was terrifying. I don't blame all of those women, I'm knocking on a bit now, but women younger than me who are still at peak fertility, who view that as a nightmare scenario. I have immense sympathy with every single one of them because I know what that feels like. And from that perspective, I understand why it might feel immensely appealing to be able to just push all of that away into a machine and to say, well, actually, we just don't have to deal with any of that at all, because now we can just, we can press a button and the zygote will turn into a fully, you can get it out of the packet in 9 months and boom, job done. Great. What I would say in response to that, I'm not going to drone on about this, but I'll just say about the experience of pregnancy. It was very different to what I expected in the end. There were downsides. I nearly died. So did my daughter.
Quite big downside.
Right, exactly. And if we're talking about technological advances, which I really wouldn't want to do without, modern obstetrics is pretty near the top of the list for very personal reasons. But gestation rewires your brain in fundamental ways. It primes you for caretaking as a mother in a way which is far more visceral and it's pre-rational. It's immensely transformative experience, and it's permanent. Once you've been rewired for mummy brain, you never really go back. And that, from the point of view of raising a child, that matters. Because after a baby is born, it's, as Winnicott once said, there's no such thing as a baby. There's only a baby and someone. A baby doesn't exist as an independent entity until it's some years into its life, arguably quite a few years into its life. And what I would say about artificial wombs is that you may think that what you're doing is creating a baby without the misery of gestation, but what you're doing in practice is creating a baby without creating a mother, because a pregnancy doesn't just create a baby, it also creates a mother. And for the subsequent healthy, beneficial, well-regulated development of the baby, that's as important as gestating the baby. So that would be my note of caution about artificial wombs.
In your book, Elise, you have a whole chapter dedicated to the idea of no more babies, which is a really scary thing for a lot of people to read, but kind of explain it to me a bit.
Yes, for the record, it's not a polemic where I'm actually saying no one must have babies. But yeah, I really think artificial wombs is a red herring, albeit a really interesting one, because it challenges us to think about bioethical questions that are relevant beyond that. It kind of challenges us to think about where our values lie, the decisions that we would make, the things that we want to prioritize. But do I think we're ever going to replace surrogacy and live in a world where armies of women are just having babies via artificial womb technology? No, I don't think that's ever going to happen. And I think the reason is not because we're not going to allow it. It is quite possible that this technology, again, it's that sort of last 10%, the first 90% is easy, and then the last 10%, the placenta is hard to master. There are all these other technological challenges. But I also think Mary's dead right about all of the rest of it. I think there are so many ways in which if we just preserved the world circa 2022, this paradigm remains. We're just living this kind of within this society and culture that we know, and that's how children are coming into the world. I think that would be horrendous. It would be truly, truly terrible.
So how do we resist it then? If we're kind of barreling towards this transhuman future and there are these different strands of transhumanism, one of which is this kind of urge towards a future woman, whether that's kind of sex robots or surrogate wombs that exist outside of the body, how do we pick and choose then which of these parts of this future we do and don't like?
We're not going to. So the way that history works is usually that far more than any kind of king, peasant, great actor, great man or woman, we like to sort of think when we think about transhumanism, it's like the Jeff Bezoses and Elon Musk and the people in power, they're driving this whole train. they might like to think that they are, but they're just not. They are the pawns of larger evolutionary forces. There's a reason that the richest people on the planet in 1901 weren't sending rockets to space, weren't getting involved in life extension companies and parabiosis, the blood transfusion stuff. It wasn't possible. And okay, they might be vehement champions of it, but there's an autocatalytic quality to this stuff. It evolves in feedback loops. We're the pawns of evolution. We are like the blind minions of natural selection, just not being able to not eat the marshmallow kind of thing. It's there and we're going to eat it. But in terms of like, does that mean every technology that is theoretically possible is going to be both invented and implemented and rolled out and loved? No. And the reason I think artificial wombs won't is because they will be leapfrogged by other technologies. I think that AI is going to potentially evolve so fast, certainly faster than any tweaks we could make to a biological meat sack, if you will, that it's going to become redundant. There's just going to be a far deeper interpenetration of the internet in this like circa 2022, scrolling and tapping and liking and getting your little dopamine feed. That's only like 10 years old. The idea that in 10 years you're still going to be doing that, it's going to go deeper. There's going to be new iterations of social media. We will spend more and more time in what I call in the book Somaland, which sounds very dystopian, where we are kind of sinking into this trend of being anesthetized by our own technologies and outsourcing a lot of cognition to this larger system. And so I think in the short term, it's the idea, there's this big idea that's really important here, is that we're in a transitional moment. It's the same as being like a kid in the Industrial Revolution in a factory or a mine, and you are kind of the collateral damage of history and you feel that this is shit. But if you zoom out, the overall arc of benefit and progress that can be conferred by these transitions can be so massive. But in the moment, you're kind of stuck in the tiny slice of time where we're still thinking about what policies do we have this year and what decisions are we making for the next couple of years. And we do need to think about all of that. But I really think it's a message that no one wants to hear, but I really think overall we're going somewhere different and we don't know what it's going to look like because it's kind of an event horizon. You just hit this moment where there's so much technological change. It's so novel. It's nothing our ape brains have ever seen before. And the consequences are going to be wildly varying and unexpected. But the idea that we're just going to sort of, I suppose like the idea that we're sort of still in this current moment of time where all we can do is sort of think about this timeline of 10 or 20 years as if the world we inhabit today is still going to be there in 10 or 20 years. I don't think it is going to be there. No guarantees, but for the first time in history, there is a chance that you're going to wake up in a new world in 10 or 20 years' time. You've already woken up into a new world from the one you were born in. And there's no evidence at this point in time that trajectory is going to get knocked off course.
Is there something kind of stoically moral or virtuous then in letting the tide flow and flowing with it rather than trying to turn your back against it?
Good Lord, no. No. Never flow with it. It's like you have to have a mind that is able to conceive of things on two scales. When you flow with it, you succumb to this idea of endless relativism, nothing matters. Why do I even bother with my life in the here and now? And no, I think we should bother with our lives in the here and now. I think we should care about the ways we bring children into the world, the ways we raise them, the ways that we educate them, the ways that we treat each other, and still try to create environments as best we can so that we can be healthy, thriving, happy, loving human beings. But I think you need to have one eye on the future where you're kind of prepared for the fact that at some point before your life is over, there might be something that just feels like a huge rug pull where you just kind of fall flat on your feet. You're like, what was that? I'm dizzy, I'm disoriented, I don't know what's just happening. And having some kind of reference point for a future that is just going to be destabilizing, I think can be an anodyne against future shock. At least there's this psychological preparation for, I can really care about things in the present, but I'm not making these 20, 30, 40, 50-year plans where I just expect that the life arcs of the 20th century are going to play them out in the same rhythm.
So, Mary, just to kind of conclude there, what's the argument, the kind of practical argument against bracing ourselves for future shock?
I don't think there's a practical argument against it.
Is there nothing we can do?
Well, I mean, I suppose, listening to you, Elise, I suppose what I was actually thinking, yes, I kind of agree with you in the sense that I think if there's something that we really do, like fundamentally, we both have in common, it's an interest in big picture systems and also a kind of millenarian streak. I mean, I listening to you, I'm like, this is just the rapture, but without a spiritual world, right? That's what you're talking about.
No, I'm not saying it's going to be good. Just different.
Right? But, you know, it's not necessarily, but it's the rapture. You know, it's our rapture anyway.
Is it?
Kind of, yeah. You know, it's a sort of upload to an unimaginable kind of, you know.
No, not upload. Something else.
So some sort of we pass over an event horizon into some unimaginable.
I'm not saying you pass with it. I'm saying.
Well, yeah, I only the few chosen. I know, indeed. But my point, we have the same millenarian streak in that I look at the future and I 100% agree with you that extrapolating out from the 20th century and the early 21st century is just as for the birds. You know, we are clearly heading. You know, it can't go on. You know, whether you look at the extractive way we relate to the natural world, or you know the rate of extinction of species worldwide, or the rate of pollution into the oceans. I mean, this idea that we can have infinite growth, as David Attenborough put it, on a finite planet is obviously nonsense. You know, something has got to change, and where we are, as you say, accelerating towards some kind of an event horizon. I mean, in my sort of more gloomy / optimistic moments, I think we'll end up with some kind of a consciousness overhaul, whether that involves, you know, transition to some sort of superhuman AI, or whether it involves a transition to a different kind of consciousness, such that we'll look back and think, how on earth could we have ever seen things in such crude mechanistic terms? I don't know, you know, because we're not there yet, but it's coming because the things can't go on. You know, and whether we get there via climate apocalypse or whether we get there via AI rapture is just, you know, that's to be seen, I suppose.
Yeah. So what I really want to know then is what's your prescription for how to live in the meantime?
Honestly, I mean, it depends. It depends a lot on scale. I mean,
you now,
right?
If you just think about us in this room, we all have a kind of similar existence day to day. How do we resist?
At the personal scale, I think I would make the strongest possible case for remaining grounded and remaining human as much as possible. You know, maintaining an intentional resistance against being absorbed into what you call Somaland, which, you know, even if that's just an hour a day that you spend doing something that's arduous enough that you can't scroll at the same time. I mean, for me, that's long distance running, but different people have different things that they do. You know, we have a very clear rule at home about screens at the table while we're eating. You know, these are small things, but cumulatively they make a difference in terms of how mindfully you integrate technology into your own life. So at the micro scale, you know, that's a start.
Maybe it's time to rehabilitate wokeness. You know, to wake up from Somaland is maybe that new movement you're
right. And at the macro scale, I mean, there are lots of different. You know, there's the sort of Davos idea that, you know, we can roll out a kind of top-down plan for terraforming humans such that we can all coexist on this finite planet and we'll all live in the pod and eat bugs and that'll be great. Or I don't know, whatever it is that they're proposing, but it's, yeah. So there's that, or, you know, there's the doomer optimists who think, you know, it's all going to go to shit, but, you know, if you collapse now and avoid the rush. And there's those guys.
Yeah. On that cheery note, I think we will turn to some questions. I want to hear from the room. I'm sure you have been reverberating with ideas. So I've got Robert at the back there with a microphone. Please wait until the microphone is with you before you start speaking. And please, 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 I pray that you will ask a question, because we love questions here. Something that would end in a question mark, should you write it down. Just over here in the black. Sorry, just at the front here. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, hi. My name's Rosie Kay. I'm a choreographer and dancer, and the new Descartesian sort of idea of chopping off the brain of the body deeply upsets me, and I feel sad that the particularly dance as an art form hasn't kind of translated itself to show the opportunities of how the body can help inform the mind and can be a dialogue between the two. But that's not my question. My question is around. I've worked with the military for about 15 years, and I have friends that have benefited from advances in medical technologies, having lost limbs in Iraq and Afghanistan. And my friend Harry Parker, a writer and captain, talks about being a hybrid human rather than a sort of transhuman. An MOD paper came out, I think it was 2010, I can't remember the title, but it was around the idea of the future soldier or the augmented soldier. And I think that's a really interesting front line of where this technology is going to be tested and going to be used. And the army sort of accepts that while drone technologies have advanced to like extraordinary degrees, you still need an actual human on the ground. And it talks through technologies that range from just sort of diet and data collection to the use of drugs, to it has an augmented soldier aspect where it talks about like soldiers that can see in the dark or that won't need sleep, or even in the future where information that's coming to a live human could immediately get transferred to a base somewhere else so that the generals can see exactly what's happening through a real live human. Now, we've already got issues around veterans being integrated back into society following warfare. That still exists, sadly, but it does still exist. One of the ethical questions the MOD paper raises is what do you do with a decommissioned cyborg or augmented soldier? What are the ethical implications for that? Do you take that technology out of them when they've got used to it, or how on earth do they adapt to life back into society, or are they just obsolete? And I wondered if you could talk about that part of the transhuman soldier.
How do we rehabilitate the super soldiers when they come back from the field?
Jesus, I didn't realize. Obviously, the prosthetic limbs is something that's talked about a lot, and would be something to replace body parts that were lost in warfare. But this concept of adaptations that are permanent in a non-integrative sense is kind of new to me. Are you talking about sort of like things to do with vision? That is, okay, that sort of thing. Honestly, I haven't sat with this or thought about it. It strikes me as an issue that clearly affects a very small niche of the population, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about it or think carefully about it. But I imagine that the military is the best cluster of people to think about them, because they engineer the technologies. They actually know how the training and the systems of soldiers works. And I imagine they have protocols already for, maybe not the best protocols, but of reintegrating soldiers back into society. So it opens up this broader question then of, I suppose our forms of social welfare and caring for people in general. I need to think about that more. I don't have a great answer for you, but it's fascinating. Thank you for raising it.
Great. Can we have another hand? Can I have one up here at the front, gentleman at the front? Thanks, Robert. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Hi. The discussion was making me think about Nietzsche's idea that Christianity was a kind of slave morality that sought to sort of make a virtue of how weak one was in order to kind of shame the strong into being as weak as you are and shame them into being kind of equal with you. Is there anything to stop the transhuman just reveling in its own strength? Will it be impervious to shame in that way?
No, I don't think so. I think there is will to power in transhumanism, undeniably. And it is worth saying that I think the phenomenon that all of us in the room need to integrate into our map of reality is the one Mary has already sort of taken on board, which is that we're in this transhuman era, that we are in this world of cyborg technologies. Transhumanism as a social movement, as an ideology, as a group of people that sort of cluster together and sort of proselytize from on high, I'm fairly skeptical about that. It's the movements themselves never became hugely influential or powerful under the banner of their movements. What I think really happened there is that they slipped the net of organizations like Humanity Plus and the World Transhumanist Association, and they kind of got spontaneously generated in the minds of lots of people who are sort of in that sort of rationalist big tech world at the helm of a lot of those companies. Is there a will to power there? And is technology used as a vehicle to agglomerate power? And are there blind spots where there is a propensity to dehumanize others under these, at times, perhaps grandiose visions of where we need to steamroll through to get to in the end? Yeah, totally. And I think it's quite possible to spin narratives where you do feel like that's a rich person, that's a very clever person, and they're telling me this is great. I must be some kind of moron if I'm not getting it. I might be some kind of chump.
Well, the other thing you can think is that those people are, in fact, do not have your best interests at heart, which is, Mary, leading on to something you said about Davos and Schwab and kind of what's happening now, which is a group of people at the World Economic Forum who make big decisions about the way that we will all live. And do you think if we take that as one option, which is you look at these people and you think, I just am simply uninformed and that they know better than I, there's an alternative, which is that these people are in fact malign actors, and that we should kind of resist that. And there is a massive kind of, some people call it conspiracy movement against that kind of one world government idea. Do you have a sense that that's going to only increase in the transhuman age?
I would say that it's very rare that anybody sets out to be evil. Nobody, so it's a great many historical atrocities have been committed by people who, in the name of the greater good. I don't think I need to enumerate. There have been a great many of them. And I think if we take for ourselves, whether under a sort of Nietzschean rejection of slave morality or simply because we can, because it's there, the power to remodel humans, there's no question that, especially if we abandon the humanist anthropology that says there is such a thing as human nature, and in fact this is a worthwhile thing that we should embrace. There'll be people who say, for the greater good, we should re-engineer humans not to be better or smarter or for individual status or any of the other reasons, but because we need to do something with all of the useless eaters. I remember there was a bioethicist, which is always a term that makes me nervous. A bioethicist a few years ago argued that we should genetically engineer humans to be smaller or perhaps allergic to meat, because that was a great way of reducing carbon emissions. From this perspective, I see no obvious, robust reason why we shouldn't genetically engineer all the useless eaters to be more docile, to be less intelligent, perhaps, to be, or just to be sterile. I mean, let's go back to some of the original eugenic visions. If we're going to talk about progressive re-engineering of the human body, let's not forget that there have been some worked examples on this before. Indeed, the first transhumanist technology came straightforwardly out of the progressive eugenicist movement. The original intent was to stop idiots. I'm not going to repeat the appalling language used by figures such as Margaret Sanger or Mary Stopes, but in essence, the idea was to stop degenerates from breeding, and thereby to improve the genetic stock of the human race. I mean, this is, it's the more technologies you have by which you can attempt to do this, the more tempting it's going to be to do it. And unless you have some kind of an anthropology or some kind of a consensus about what humans are, it's not clear to me that in fact you can mount any sort of credible defense against that at all. And I have deep concern about where that takes us very quickly.
Right, but that's a case in point about ape brains, right? That when given all these levers of a complex system, we routinely pull the wrong ones in the wrong ways. with the best of justifications and intentions. It shows us that we've kind of agreed that we're at this tipping point in history where there is so much complexity that needs to be managed, and we don't have the brains that are fit to manage it. We are the wrong stewards to keep things ticking over in a world that is sustainable for the long haul.
But logically, based on what you're saying is that, you know, we can't possibly find the right button to press because of our ape brains, and so therefore we should find the right button to press in our ape brains in order to make that better. But but surely by your logic, if we're guaranteed to pull the wrong lever, we're going to end up pulling the wrong lever in the process of trying to ameliorate ourselves.
What we're going to do is pull lots of levers, and many of them are going to be the wrong ones.
Okay, on this we agree.
Yeah. Oh my God, yes. The result, like, again, us just as the blind minions of evolution, more technology is going to evolve. It's almost, this is where the Hail Mary comes in. It's like, it's almost just, we kind of hope that what emerges out of the ashes of the old order, that what emerges from some of the AI systems that we've seeded, you know, blindly, we don't understand them, they're really confusing to us, is that goes on to evolve in a direction that might seed sustainable, intelligent
Can I just
life.
pick you up on the blind minions of evolution? Because actually I can test that. I can test the idea that there's anything blind or stupid about evolution. I mean, if we're going to talk about an immensely complex adaptive system, which incredibly sensitive to, you know, prevailing conditions in any given environment, and you know, and that evolves over time, you know, in dialogue with an countless other factors and systems and material conditions, and in our case, cultural conditions, etc., and so on. The idea of describing that as something which is blind or clumsy or incompetent just seems to me mistaken.
Oh, incompetent, no. So it's brilliant from a human standpoint. It's blind in the sense that evolution is not conscious. And so the blind watchmaker from Richard Dawkins' argument, Paley's watch, like, it's so complex, the clock must have been designed by a great God in the sky designer. No, it's designed by a force that doesn't possess consciousness, that nevertheless is selecting in a way that what a human brain would.
I mean, you're assuming it doesn't possess consciousness. I mean, we can't establish. I mean, I said we wouldn't get into metaphysics.
No,
but, you know,
here we are.
Let's not go there. But just to finish that thought.
Yeah.
About evolution, you know, it's just to you know, if we're going to talk about confronting ideas, you know, one possibly confronting idea is that in fact the entire kind of techno-optimist transhumanist trajectory is the evolutionary blind alley, and the fact that we're going to end up destroying ourselves and going up in a mushroom cloud or whatever is in fact the evolutionary feedback which will set us on the better future trajectory. I'm sorry.
I mean, the question started with Nietzsche and we end with that. So he would have been proud. All right, let's go for someone at the back, right at the back at the left. Thank you.
Hi. This period of exponential technological growth that we have described since like the mid-20th century up until now has partly been fueled by an equally rapid population growth. And all the attendant brain power that comes with that. And that's kind of really springboarded this age of globalization that we all kind of now slightly take for granted. But if you look at, you know, birth rates are falling across the developed world, particularly in what I think is still the world's main manufacturing center, China, which is kind of on the verge of an imminent and fairly severe population decline. And there's certain sort of like global forecasters who think we're kind of at the tail end of this age of globalization, and we're kind of going to transition into economies which are more localized and realities that are more localized. So kind of we've talked about how it's too late to put this whole transhumanist surge back in its box, but is there a chance that those developments and the kind of world that we could see in 50 or 60 years could, for now at least, put it back in the box for us?
No. So what we're seeing almost with the depopulation trend, which is absolutely true. It is more than half the countries around the world have below replacement fertility rates. So fertility rate means the average number of children born to a woman in her reproductive lifetime. So we need a replacement rate above 2 because 1 to replace mum, 1 to replace dad. Not all children live to reproductive maturity. So 2, 2.1, that's kind of the benchmark. All of the Western developed countries are below that benchmark. So is China, so is Taiwan, so is India, and on and on. That's kind of the trajectory around the world. What this poses as a conundrum is almost a state, I think, of likely technological lock-in, where because we are compelled to eke out through incentives ever more economic growth, or at least to try and sustain some growth, we don't have enough people to do all the jobs, to pay into the tax system, to keep that ticking along. We need more machines. And China is, I think, per capita owns the most industrial robots of any nation. So yeah, what you're talking about, sort of like maybe bringing more manufacturing and stuff onshore, that seems likely. For the world to then siloize and localize, I think that seems very unlikely. There's certainly political trends in that direction where people are wanting more sovereignty over, smaller realms. But we are so locked into a global system that is so interdependent on each other. And yeah, those declining fertility rates really, to me, portend a future in which, in spite of ourselves, without really consciously realizing we're doing it, we end up just out of short-term necessity, not thinking of anything transhuman, just thinking about how we balance the budget this year, investing in the military. Military is one of the biggest investors of tech R&D, more and more machines that do more and more advanced things that suddenly we realize we can use for all sorts of things that human labor was once used for. And then that becomes very socially destabilizing, which is a whole other minefield, but I'm keen to hear what Mary has to say.
I agree that's possible. I mean, if you look at Japan, that's kind of the picture there already. I mean, they have, robots in care homes and, all sorts of deeply dystopian, one might say, attempts to automate out things which are not really intuitively automatable. I suppose, one way of looking at the population crash and the fertility crash, which is measurable and everywhere, is that it's more evolutionary feedback. It's a clear signal that whatever it is that we're doing is just wrong. We're not flourishing, we're not thriving. We're not making more of ourselves, and this is clear evolutionary feedback. And perhaps the human population will start growing again once we innovate our way, or in some way find our way culturally out of the dead end, which increasingly I think we're in. And within which it seems like the only possible fix is more of the same solution, which seems to be dragging us into this dead end in the first place. From where I'm sitting, and from, to an extent, personal experience and personal reflection, it seems to me that the reason people are not having kids it's not because of the housing crisis. It's fundamentally because people they just don't want to. People just aren't up for it because we've reached a level of atomization where it's still. It's hard. I talk to other mums at the school gate, and it's just a slog. It's very lonely. I went on holiday. I took my daughter away over the summer. My husband was busy; he was working. I took her camping for a few days, and we happened to coincide on the campsite with a big group, all with kids about the same age as ours, who all get together every summer. And for a couple of days, it was just so easy because we just created the village around, and there was a feral horde of kids that ran around, and they all had water fights, and it was like I remember in my childhood. And it's just not like that anymore, ever. And it's grim. On a day-to-day basis, everything is effort, and no wonder nobody's having any kids, because it's effort.
We've been offered easier augmented lives. It makes me think of how in Japan they have to give kind of government subsidies, bonuses to young men to come out of their flats and engage in the wider world, because they literally have whole kind of classes of people who effectively lock in.
If we're talking about evolutionary feedback, a culture and a system which is actively antinatalist is going to, if you extrapolate that out over the long term, it's just not a culture which is destined to survive. And I think it almost doesn't matter how much technology you employ. You know, we're either going to accelerate out into Elise's putative post-human future, or the culture's just going to go kaput and we'll end up with something different in its place, possibly with some dim memories of the culture that went before, and possibly perpetuated by whoever it is who figures out how to escape the Skinner machine and buck the trend for antinatalism. Or possibly both. I don't know. Maybe we'll end up with a weird some Eloi up at the top who've fused themselves with cats or lizards, or turned themselves into tentacled kind of cyborg.
You've got another career in motivational
Right.
speaking. All right, let's take another question.
And they're down at the bottom.
Come here,
we'll have the Mormons. I
right
don't
to
know.
the front here. Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you. I just wondered what Mary and Elisa have to say about religion. I mean, you both talked about need for a change in consciousness to avert one form of disaster or another, whether it's to accept the limitations of technology or to expand our technological imagination. But it's all a very secular discussion. And I'd like to know whether you think religious belief has any part to play in making the world better. I mean, you couldn't have had this kind of discussion 50 or 100 years ago in purely secular terms. It wouldn't have been possible. Now, you avoid it whenever you can.
I've avoided the religious faith thing deliberately so far, because it's just a can of worms, as you say. The only thing I will say about it is that pretty much the only people left who are still having kids are people of faith. And you know, if you want to talk about evolutionary feedback, I think there's possibly something there. Over to you, Elise.
Yeah,
what would you say about religious faith?
I mean, on the note of evolutionary feedback, I mean, galaxy brain version of that is that evolution's found a new replicator. So you would see this almost, if you visualize history, this series of S curves, right? So these like exponential spikes of huge growth and then plateau, and the plateau is the base of the next transition. So you can think of like Paleolithic, giving rise to the preconditions for agricultural, giving rise to the preconditions for industrial, and human giving rise to the preconditions for post-human, for AI future. So we know that AIs are incredible replicators, right? Like they don't need 20 years to mature into a consciousness after birth. They don't need to be gestated. You can just make copies of them. Not saying better or worse, only saying that it's not as if I get the signal that evolution is sort of going, okay, intelligent life is fucked up. It's hit its limits. Okay, that's all going to go collapse now. There are the preconditions for other forms of intelligent life to spring forth from what we are. As to religion, definite can of worms.
You'll come to it towards the end of your remarks.
I have, strategically. Yeah, I mean, I'm a raging atheist. I don't have any deep conception of what it is like to carry a religious sensibility in a way that informs thinking. I do have an understanding of what a spiritual sensibility is like, and I think all humans do, and that it's inborn. And that, as with embodiment, there is a lot of feedback that comes through that to annex ourselves from it often does make us worse thinkers. But as for any particular organized religion, is it essential that we sort of bring a doctrine into the ways that we think about this present moment? I can't see any good argument for that being the case. I can certainly see it being a good argument for consolation and for organized religion, independent of the doctrine, really being something that knits people together, gives them common stories, builds communities. I don't see that needs to be done in a religious rather than a secular way.
Just pushing back on that for a sec. You know, if Tom Holland were here, he would argue that in fact you can't help thinking about things to an extent within an inherited set of religious priors, and that in fact pretty much all of the conversation that we've had this evening has been conducted within a broadly Christian heritage frame. I mean, the fact is that we're both talking basically in eschatological terms. You know, I mean, it's not quite death, judgment, heaven and hell, but you know, in a sense, both of us are talking about accelerating towards some kind of an endpoint at which we'll transition to something different, which is it's fundamentally an apocalyptic vision, and that paradigm is directly inherited from the Christian tradition, whether or not you choose to think of yourself in those terms.
How much
even
of it,
the, I mean, you know, this is such a nerd argument, and it's probably not the place for it. It's such a can of worms. I'm sorry.
It is.
But yeah.
But how much of it is coming from the Judeo-Christian cultural traditions, which, no denying, have hugely shaped this country and this culture? And how much of it is coming from an inherited sensibility that is biological, in the sense that we're storytelling animals, we are pattern recognition mammals, and that we fit data from the world, we fit phenomena into these pattern narratives that across so many religions sort of follow similar arcs, probably because it's just a byproduct of how our minds work. So we could be talking about scientific and technological phenomena, and we sort of end up in similar places with similar stories, because this is how we tell stories. There's conflict, there's transition, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end point. It's kind of in the nature of story itself. But I think it might be both.
But again, you know, if you're thinking about, if we're talking in apocalyptic terms, then, you know, if I were, I mean, forgive me if there are any any Hindus in the audience, but the Hindus that I know just straightforwardly don't think in those terms. They're like, yeah, no, you get a whole load of advance, and then you get the Kali Yuga, and then it all goes to shit, and then it all comes around again. And that's just how it works. It goes around. History goes in a circle. It doesn't go in a straight line.
Yeah.
And your S curves that go on and on ad infinitum is, you know, or perhaps not, and you know, perhaps I don't know, to an apocalypse. You know, that's very much that's one set of religious paradigms, and I don't think you can say, oh yeah, no, they all join up at the back. I don't think it's as simple as, oh yeah, and that's maybe just biology and evolution. No. Because in fact, you know, there are, if you compare, you know, sort of the people of the book, if you like, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the paradigms which descend out of that, even when they're secularized. Even the idea of secularization is itself, you know, fundamentally Christian in derivation. But then, you know, and then you compare that to the paradigms which sort of descend out of the Hindu faith, for example. It's just that they're structurally so different.
They are, but those are the two main structures. Eternal recurrence recurs quite a lot, and you kind of get, you know, history goes round and round, or it doesn't. But there are only so many ways that we tell stories, so this is one of the very common modes in which things fit.
Unfortunately, I have to follow the arc of history as well and say that our time is up, but we will be sticking around in this room and downstairs in the bar and cafe to continue the conversation as we always do. Thanks so much to our online audience for joining us, to everyone in the room, and most importantly, to Mary and Elise for their fascinating insights. Can you join me in thanking them for that? Do stick around and we'll see you here or downstairs. The bar is now open, so enjoy.